get the message. Great. Mia, you're on mute.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Such a nice turnout today. And we have with us today a very apt and such a fascinating topic of perceptions of epidemics in Hebrew poetry, from biblical antiquity to early modernity. And thank you so much, Dr. Yehoshua Granat, for coming to speak to us today. I'll just introduce everyone to Dr. Granat, who serves as a lecturer in the Department of Hebrew Literature at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And formerly, he was a Rothschild postdoctoral fellow in Oxford University and was a member of the Buber Society of Fellows in Hebrew University. His main fields of research are Hebrew and Aramaic poetry of late antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the early modern period. And he's published on various topics related to these fields, which I'll be, I'm sure, looking at after the talk, with an emphasis on liturgical poetry, piyut, from the Cairo Geniza in Hebrew, English, and Spanish. His forthcoming book deals with liturgical poems based on biblical psalms by the 10th century Haitan, Yosef ibn Abitur. Another forthcoming book is a monograph on pre-existence in early piyut. So thank you very much, Dr. Yehoshua Granat, for coming to speak to us. I'm going to ask everyone to save their questions till after the talk, and to please put your questions in the chat addressed to me, and I'll read out your questions and to Dr. Granat after the talk.
Thank you very much, Mia, if I may. Okay, so maybe I'll first share the screen, yes, so that we are on the same page or the same PowerPoint presentation. Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much for inviting me, Ophira and Saeko and Mia. I'll begin by reading just an introductory paragraph. Honestly, I didn't have time to prepare a longer script, so we'll play it by the ear. We'll go along the text that I gathered here in this presentation, and I presume that some of you know some Hebrew, but some of you don't necessarily have a command of the Hebrew tongue. So we'll take all that into account. Okay, so outbreaks of epidemics were part of human and social experience from time immemorial. It is thus no wonder to find their echoes and reflections in the very long history of Hebrew poetry. In my presentation today, I would like to focus on two phases of this many-faceted history. Firstly, I'd like to discuss some representations and perceptions of epidemics in the poetry of the Hebrew Bible, which obviously laid out the foundations of the religious attitude to these conditions in later Jewish and Christian, and to some extent also Muslim civilizations. Later on, we will consider some poems by Moshe Catalano, a 17th century Hebrew poet from northern Italy, who experienced the severe plague epidemic of 1630. Beyond its value as documents from historical and epidemiological perspectives, Catalano's, beyond its value, okay, yes, Catalano's cycle of plague poems reflect a noteworthy conceptual turn to a naturalistic attitude towards the condition of epidemics, a turn which took place in the early modern times. This turn is manifested in an interesting manner through these poems' subtle interplay with biblical and rabbinic sources or intertexts, and I hope to show you some of these things in the end of the presentation. And obviously, if you'll have questions, I'll do my best to answer. Okay, so let's start as promised with the Bible. And the first biblical text I'd like to consider is taken from the largest book of the Hebrew Bible, which is actually an anthology of poems, the book of Psalms. And this is Psalms 91, a psalm which had quite an interesting afterlife, as we'll see later on. And this is, I think, some sort of we can call it a locus classicus, or the most typical apotropaic text or poem that we can find in the Hebrew Bible. By apotropaic, we mean a poem that serves as some sort of a protection, or its message is some sort of a protection on the fragile human being, a divine protection against threats from the outside. And among these threats are obviously the threats of illness and of epidemics. So let's just have a look at some of the verses. Yes, יושב בסתר עליון בצל שדי יתלונן. It is the person that dwells, yes, in the covered, or in the shadow, or in the hiding of the Most High, of God. Yeah. אומר לאדוני מחסיר מצודתי אלוהי אבטח בו. I'll say of the Lord, who is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. And you trust God because he saves you from, as I said, from the threats, from the demonic enemies. כי הוא יצילך מפח יקוש מדבר אבות, that he will deliver thee from the snare of the fowler and from the noisome pestilence. Pestilence, dever is the biblical Hebrew word for the plague, for the pestilence. Dever avot is quite a unique phrase. It's translated traditionally, or in the KJV already, as noisome pestilence. Perhaps it can be more appropriately understood as a destructive pestilence. In any case, the pestilence is one of the threats, of the outer threats, the external threats that God protects the believer from. And then we have a very beautiful metaphorical image of God as having wings and covering in his wings the believer. Yes, בעברתו יסך לך ותחת כנפיו תכסה צינה וסוחרה עמיתו. He will cover thee with his pinions, and under his wings shalt thou take refuge. His truth is a shield and a buckler. God's truth is the thing that can protect you. Later on, there's a very beautiful, elaborate description of this message, or elaboration of this message. Yes, the threats. The psalm enumerates the various threats and the divine protection against each of them. And again, we have here the pestilence among them. Yes, לא תירא מפחד לילה, מחץ יעוף יומם, מדבר באופל יהלוך. Yeah, מדבר באופל יהלוך, of the pestilence that walketh in darkness. And the image of pestilence in the dark is interesting. Perhaps it reflects the sense of something that is unintelligible. You can't see it. You can't touch it. It lurks somewhere in the darkness. Yeah. But the message is, יפול מצדך אלף ורבבה מימינך אליך לא ייגש. 1,000 may fall at thy side. That's like an epidemic. Yeah. Many people are ill. Many people are dead. 1,000 may fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand. ורבבה מימינך, it shall not come nigh thee. אליך לא ייגש. Only the wicked people will suffer. And then again, God is the refuge. כי אתה אדוני מחסי. There shall no evil befall thee, לא תאונה אליך רעה. And again, ונגע לא יקרב באוהליך. The evil that threats the human being is obviously the nega, the illness, the plague. Neither shall any plague come nigh thy tent. So this is perhaps the most archaic, the most basic attitude. The plague, the pestilence, the epidemic is some sort of a demonic threat, and God is there for the believer to protect him or her from this external devil or demon. A group of demons, yes. So this is Psalm 91. I may perhaps some of the participants here who are familiar with Jewish liturgy know that this psalm is traditionally said every Saturday night in the beginning of a new week, because the Jewish week ends when Saturday ends, it's Saturday night when the Shabbat is over, and then a new week begins. So this psalm is recited, is uttered as some sort of a good omen, perhaps, of a talisman, of a way to ask for a protection during the forthcoming week. And we have another example, additional examples of this interesting afterlife. Yes, the nachleben of this unique psalm. For example, you can see here a very nice piece of jewelry here. This is. I hope you can see what's written above it. I can't at the moment for some reason. Yes, this is a Byzantine amuletic armband, and it has the biblical text in Greek of both the famous Shema, the Jewish credo, from the book of Deuteronomy that is recited every day. That's a very important text in Jewish liturgy, and also the first verse of this very psalm, of this Psalm 91, and presumably it had even more verses which were lost in this piece of jewelry. And on the left hand side, you can see a fragment from the Cairo Geniza. It's in the famous Taylor Schechter collection in the University in Cambridge University Library. And this is a magical amulet, as it's written here. You have here names of angels. Some of them are quite famous to you all, even if you can't read Hebrew. Yes, Michael, Gabriel, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, who is actually very important for our purpose, because Raphael is the angel of healing. Yes, Refuah, healing. Raphael is the angel of healing. Okay, so we have Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and also more exotic names like Tzidkiel, Kafziel, and others. So this is an interesting text for the scholars of Jewish mysticism. But before this list of names, we have a text which looks quite unintelligible. Yud Bet Ain. Perhaps for somebody who doesn't know Hebrew, it looks the same, but for one who knows Hebrew, it looks like gibberish. Okay, but when you look into it, you can see that these are the initials of the first words of the Psalms. Yoshev Beseter Elyon. Yes, Yud Bet Ain. That's the sequence of letters that you have here by manner of what's called notarikon, yeah, or shorthand, yeah. And then Betzel Shaddai Yitlonan, Bet Shin Yud, okay. And the last bit of the psalm is the bit that speaks of the pestilence, yeah. Ki hu yatzilcha mipach yakush midever havot, okay. So the text itself is used. Not only the text speaks of God as the protector, and now the text itself becomes some sort of a magical protector for the person who carries the amulet of this kind or another. So this is one conception of the epidemic as some sort of a demonic threat that God or some sort of a magical aid should be helpful in saving you from. But as we all know, the plague was not only something that God prevented in the Bible. God also used the plague. And the most famous case is obviously the case of the Exodus, the story of Israel in Egypt. And this is a very impressive painting by the English painter Joseph Mallord William Turner, the 10th plague of Egypt. Yes, and it's very dramatic, all the scenery. By the way, although I'm sitting in Jerusalem and you are sitting all over the globe, more or less, this is, after all, a lecture under the auspices of the University of Glasgow, so it might be nice to know that in your museum, in the Hunterian, you have an etching of this very painting by Turner. You can see here the pyramid, yes, of the Egyptian pyramid, and also the figures, more clearly the figures of the devastated parents whose firstborns were killed. So they were killed by some sort of plague or an epidemic, which was caused by God as a punishment to the Egyptians for the oppression of the people of Israel. Yeah. In the book of Psalms, we have two Psalms. One of them is Psalms 78, which retell this story, this narrative in verse, in poetry. And it refers to God as the one who was accountable, was in charge of making all these disasters as punishments for the Egyptians. Yeah? אשר שם במצרים אותותיו ומופתיו בשדה צוען. He had wrought his signs in Egypt and his wonders in the field of Zoan. And at first, it described the more, you could call it the agricultural plagues, the frogs, the hail, and so forth. This is another painting by Turner. And then the psalm turns to the more epidemiological plagues, if you'd like, or the epidemics, the illnesses. Yes. And this is, by the way, this is a very famous verse. I think that more people know this verse than know the whole psalm, because the verse that I'm going to read in a moment is quoted in the Passover Haggadah, the Haggadah of Pesach that is recited in the first night of Passover. Yeah. ישלח בם חרון אפו, עברה וזעם וצרה, משלחת מלאכי רעים. So the evil angels, that's very interesting, the Malachei Ra'im are now the messengers. They are sent by God himself to punish the Egyptians. And God's rage, God's anger is manifested through the epidemic, through the deadly epidemic. Yes, לא חסך ממוות נפשם, וחייתם לדבר הסגיר. Gave their life over to the pestilence. Now, the pestilence or the plague or the epidemics can be used by God not only as punishment to Israel's enemies, such as the Egyptians, it can also be used as a means of punishment to Israel themselves, to God's people when they do wrong. Against it, some sort of a divine economy of sin and punishment, and the epidemic is the punishment. Here, I suppose the locus classicus is two passages from the Pentateuch of it's not exactly poetry, but it has some sort of a poetic force to it. It's actually a sequence of curses in which, or warnings, very severe warnings, in which Israel are warned to obey to God's commandments, because if they don't, the consequence is going to be very, very serious. Yes, and the etiology of all these disasters that are plastically described, the etiology is very clear. That's all because of the evil of thy doings. Mipnei roa malalecha. That's Deuteronomy 28. And there's a whole catalog of diseases here, and among them is also the pestilence, or yes, the plague, the devil. ידבק אדוני בך את הדבר, את הדבר, yeah? The Lord will make the pestilence cleave unto thee, and yes, the addressee is Israel, the people of Israel, עד כלותו אותך, etc. And there's a general warning or some sort of a mythological metaphor, והיו שמך אשר על ראשך נחושת, והארץ אשר תחתיך ברזל, thy heaven that is over thy head shall be brass, and the earth that is under thee shall be iron. So the earth is going to be very hostile, alienated to you, as some sort again of divine punishment. Interestingly, God can sometimes be both the one who punishes and causes the illness or the epidemics, and the one who cures it. I think the best example is the story of the serpent of brass from the book of Numbers. Israel, again, are not very cooperative. Yes, yes, perhaps this brings to mind this biblical episode. They speak against God, and the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people. Yes, וישלח אדוני בעם את הנחשים השרפים. So the virus, if you'd like, or the bacteria here is the serpents, and the serpents make the people ill and dead. And then the people come to Moses and ask him to pray for them, and Moses does pray to God, and the Lord says unto him, yeah, make thee a fiery serpent and set it upon a pole. Yeah, that's the famous pole of the brazen serpent. And Moses made a serpent of brass and set it upon the pole. And it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, when he looked unto the serpent of brass, he lived. Yeah, והיה אם נשך הנחש את איש, והביט אל נחש הנחושת וחי. So the antidote is some sort of a simulacrum, or it's similar to the poison, to the snake, a snake of brass against the snake. Interestingly, this biblical episode is touched upon in the Mishnah, the canonical early rabbinic work in tractate Rosh Hashanah. Perhaps some of you know this passage. It's very interesting, I think, from the theological perspective. It shows an interesting change in theological conception. The rabbis ask, nachash memit or nachash mechaye, but could the serpent slay or the serpent keep alive? From the biblical perspective, the answer is yes. And yes, obviously, that's what the story tells. Yes, at first the serpent's killed, and then the serpent of brass kept alive those who looked at it. No, but the rabbis won't accept it. That's too magical for them. They explain it a bit differently. It is rather to teach thee, that's Danby translation, that such time as the Israelites directed their thoughts on high, מסתכלים כלפי מעלה, their thoughts or their gazes on high, and kept their hearts in subjection to their Father in heaven, ומשעבדין את ליבם לאביהם שבשמיים, they were healed. That was the way of healing, to the inner belief, the inner attentiveness towards God. Yeah. Otherwise, they pined away. Im lav hayu nimukim. So this is a different theological perspective, but still the conception is that the disease is caused by some sort of a moral fault, and the cure, the healing, is through some sort of a moral or inner religious or mental transformation. So that was a very brief survey of attitudes towards epidemics or plagues in biblical antiquity. And when we look through the Middle Ages, there are several piyutim, liturgical poems, which were composed in circumstances of epidemics, of mass illnesses. And the attitude is basically the same. We turn to God, we ask him to heal us, to stop the evil angel from making us ill or dead. Now, the second part, the latter part of my presentation, I'd like to have a look at some lesser known texts from a later period, from the period of early modernity, which is very interesting. A period in terms of the change. Your cluster is called Challenge. Yes, tradition. Ophira, help me with the name of the cluster.
Religion, challenge, and change.
Religion, challenge, and change. So that's very apt. There's a change there. Religion is still there. The biblical heritage in Jewish context, in Christian context, and as we'll see, but there's also some sort of a change when facing the challenges, and the early modern centuries had many challenges of epidemics, of severe epidemics, which were probably related also to the urbanization which took place during these times. So let's begin. Actually, let's take a short detour to your area, to Scotland. We have from the 16th century here some sort of an amulet. Again, a 16th century wheel charm, a Gaelic wheel charm for protection from harm, and it's the context is protection against violent death, poison, and demons of the air, which were thought to spread the plague. So you still have this kind of culture in the early modern age. Also among professional doctors. I found this in a very interesting, the website of the National Library of Scotland. They had in 2016, I believe, an exhibition on the plague, and they presented an early Scots book from the 16th century by Gilbert Skane. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name correctly. And this is a quotation from this book, which is a medical book. The principal preservative cure of the pestilence, is to return to God. So basically, this is a biblical, we can call it a biblical attitude. Another example of that from the British Isles is this interesting chapbook, The Christian Refuge, or Heavenly Antidote Against the Plague. Yes, and you can see the Grim Reaper here, which is actually the personification of the plague. And inter alia, he says, having thus by holy meditation prepared thy soul, thou mayest next proceed to use some of these medicines for thy body, etc. Yet trust not so much in the physique as in the blessing of God, without which all physique is ineffectual. And then again, and you can see how much it's relied upon the Hebrew Bible, or the Bible in general. Take the herb of virtue, of the doing of good, and it refers to the Psalms, and the herb of patience, waiting upon the Lord, wherewith possess your souls, yourselves. Instead of herb grace, some sort of a medical herb, take another called Christ's grace. And in the place of elder leaves, again, some sort of a medical plant, elders' examples, following and imitating the elders of Israel. And again, we have biblical proof texts for that. On the other hand, we can find in this period representations of biblical scenes relating to epidemics, in which we can see a new attitude, a new sensitivity. And an interesting example before we return to the Hebrew poems is this painting, this masterpiece by Nicolas Poussin, the French painter, which is called the plague of Ashdod. It's based on a biblical scene from the Book of Kings, a typical scene of the plague as punishment to the Philistines. And it was painted in 1630, 1631, exactly at the time of the outbreak of the pestilence in northern Italy that we'll return to in a moment. And this is obviously a very impressive painting, but I came across this very interesting article by an art historian, Sheila Barker. It's called Poussin, Plague and Early Modern Medicine. And I just want to quote a few sentences, a few points that she makes, which are very interesting, I think. Yes, she speaks of a new understanding, just a second, of plague as a contagious disease caused by a distinct transmissible pathogen, and she points out that in the medicine of the time, this concept was developing, and Poussin was most probably aware of that. And she goes on. Poussin did not cling to the conventional notion of plague as a universal affliction with origin in the stars, and even though he depicts here an instance of plague instigated by a heavenly fiat, yeah, he resists the notion that all Ashdod citizens might suffer an identical fate directly at the hands of God. His painting abounds with reference to the mechanics of transmission. Moreover, the composition itself reads as a visual metaphor of contagion. Extending from one end to the other is a great concatenation of human bodies linked by the reaching, touching, grasping, and leaning, each creating a dangerous possibility of human-to-human contagion, etc. So when Poussin takes the biblical scene, he manifests in his painting a new conception of a more naturalistic conception of the plague, and perhaps warns the viewers from behaving as the figures here do, touching each other in such a concatenation, as she calls it. So let us turn now to the last part of my short presentation, to Padua, of the very same period, Padua in northern Italy. And we have from there a very fascinating and important document about epidemics in Jewish history. And I refer to a chronicle, yes, called Olam Hafuch, a world turned upside down. And this chronicle was written by a physician, a doctor, who was the father of the poet that we are going to discuss in a moment. Avraham Catalano, he wrote this treatise, and in the manuscript, as some sort of a supplement, there's a series of poems by his son. His son was called Moshe Catalano. Yeah, Moshe Chai ben Avraham Catalano. I must admit that scholars did not look at his poems very closely, but I believe they worth it. So I'd like to show you that through a few examples. It's a sequence of 16 poems. Each poem is in the pattern of an octave, in ottava rima, what's called in Italian. So let's look at the first one. I think it's the only one that was translated into English hitherto. Later on, we'll show you two fresh translations of two additional poems from this cycle. And it begins, how much time do I have, by the way? Mia or Ophira?
Well, maybe 10 minutes, is that okay?
10 minutes, okay, we'll play it by the ear. So this begins with very dramatically, Dever betoch ircha. If plague comes to your city, and literally plague is in your city, what do you do? So the biblical instinct would be, just go and pray to God to save your soul. No, he's very practical. He gives you instructions on a very practical level. Dever betoch ircha pazer raglecha michutz lamachane b'makom naki. Plague comes into your city, betake yourself outside the camp, outside the city affected by the epidemic, to a place that is clean. And it's very interesting, the reference to the to shoes made from brass and iron. Perhaps you remember the reference to brass and iron in the context of the divine curses on the people who will be ill with pestilence because they didn't obey God. No, he says, make your shoes out of iron and brass. It sounds a bit too heavy, I suppose, but he means that make them very stable, very apt, so that you can run very quickly and far as you need. Be smart and flee quickly. כי אם תעמוד שם בתוך עירך. Now he turns to the other possibility. If you stay in the city when the outbreak begins, תהיה כחלב מתבוסס בקיא. You'll be like a dog who rolls in vomit. This is a very grotesque image. We can call it a Baroque image, but it's based on a biblical verse, a verse from the book of Proverbs. Yes, כחלב שב על קיאו, כסיל שונה באיוולתו. As a dog that returneth to his vomit, so is a fool that repeateth his folly. So Catalano's message is don't be a fool. Learn from experience. Don't replicate the errors of the past. And the attitude is very much empirical, naturalistic. אם בשחר לא תפתח עיניים, תמשש אפלה בצהריים. If you don't open your eyes at dawn, in the beginning of the event, you'll stumble at noon in darkness. It will accelerate very quickly, perhaps we'll say in an exponential manner, and then you'll be you'll find yourself facing a big problem. Two additional poems from the same very interesting cycle, and we are focused here not on the practical advice, medicinal and so forth, but on the conceptual framework. This is a very interesting text from this point of view. אמת כי אין נסתר מנגד עין, יושב בסתר ורואה כל סתר. Truly nothing is hidden from God's eye, he who dwells in hiding, seeing every hiding. This is a clear reference to Psalm 91, which describes the people the person who sits in the covert, in the hiding of the Most High. So Catalano begins in some sort of a gesture. Yes, it's true. God sees everything. That's all true. By the way, Yoshev Beseter is not the one here. Is some sort of a phrase denoting God. It's not the person who is protected by God. Anyhow, then he proceeds and makes his point, which is actually very different. He's against being too confident just in the help of God. אכן אם בעד נפשו אדם עין, ויחפוץ למודשה מבלי סדר, ובלי השכל כמו שיכור מיין, יאמר, אלוהים לי מגן וסתר. Yet if one cares not to guard oneself, as if he wills to die there, with no order is very important to him, seder, and with no reason, like one drunk of wine, he says, God is my shield, my refuge. And this is again a paraphrase of Psalm 91. Omar ladonai machzi u'metzudati. I will say of the Lord, who is my refuge and my fortress. And in a way, this is caricatured here. It is even ridiculed here, this attitude. You can sense here perhaps a tone of polemic. The couplet, the final couplet says, likewise, this is the final couplet, הלא עין רואה, אוזן שומעת, כי יאבד כטיפש נבער מדעת. The eye does see, the ear does hear, he'll perish as a fool, devoid of knowledge. So again, to be a fool is something very terrible in the eyes of Catalano. One must act according to reason, according to knowledge, and somebody who is so religious that he trusts God and doesn't do anything, well, perhaps he deserves to be punished. The phrase "Ein ro'a ozen shomat," yes, the eye does see, the ear does hear. Here we have an interplay with the rabbinic text from the Mishnah, from Mishnah Avot, yes, a famous Mishnah saying that the person should be aware of three things about him, and we'll return to the three things in a moment. And two of them are the seeing eye and hearing ear of God. God sees everything that you do, so behave accordingly. That's the message of the Mishnah. I'm not sure what Catalano means by using these words. Does he mean that God himself actually agrees that this person should die, or perhaps he refers to some sort of a common sense? Every eye can see that, every ear can hear that the fate of this person will be very bad. Interesting. In any case, you can see some sort of a subversive interplay of this poet with the canonical, biblical, and rabbinic sources. And the last poem from this cycle, also very interesting, and it plays with the very same Mishnaic text. Yishamer bishlosha devarim eile, ve'i ata ba liday choli dever. Keep care of these three things, and you will not be taken by the plague. And as I said, this is the very same Mishnah. Istakel bishlosha dvarim, consider three things, and thou wilt not fall into the hands of transgression. Ve'i ata ba liday avira. So this is again a moral, a religious dictum. Yes, you should be aware of three things, histakel, so that you don't commit sin. Catalano takes this phrase and make it again into something very practical. Do these things, or keep away from these three things, the following three things, so that you won't be taken by the plague. So it's some sort of preventive advice, medicinal advice. So what are the three things? First, calling God. This is still important. Call God, revered in praises, doing marvels, the one who saves you from disasters. But then the practical element. Berach o hisager ki beveit kele, pentamut az vetisager bakever. Flee or enclose yourself as if in prison, lest you shall die and will be closed in grave. And the third thing, arrange your sustenance in good order. Order is very important to him, as I said. Wait on the Lord and keep your way. And this last line, I must share with you something that I discovered only yesterday when I was talking to Ophira. This is a paraphrase of a very specific paraphrase of a Psalmic verse, yes? Psalm 37, Kavel Adonai ushmor darko. Wait for the Lord and keep his way. So the biblical verse tells you to keep God's way, to keep the Torah, to keep the commandment, to be morally good. Here, Catalano makes it an interesting twist. You should wait on the Lord on the one hand, but keep your way, meaning take all the necessary measures on the rationalistic, practical, scientific level. Perhaps we can end at this point. Just to add one thing, it's interesting to see that on the one hand, he still preaches for believing in God. On the other hand, he lays stress on the more scientific or medical attitude. It's a very interesting combination. It's not unique to him. We have such combination all over the place already in the Middle Ages, of course, but the specific attitude, there's something very specifically early modern about it. And it should also be taken into account that during this period, people were also aware from the medical point of view of the importance of the mental resilience in coping with the disease or with the epidemic. For example, the words of Etienne Binet, Jesuit, wrote a spiritual guide to surviving the plague, and he calls his reader to destroy and eradicate fear, because there is nothing that renders you more vulnerable to plague than the fear of it, etc. And he gives even some sort of a biological explanation to that. So Catalano's call to believe in God side by side with doing all the necessary things in terms of quarantine and so forth, also is also perhaps grounded in his medical frame of mind. So that was more or less what I was planning to present. I hope that it made some sense to you, and I thank you again for your attention.
Thank you so much, Yehoshua, for that really very fascinating talk. Right now, you could probably stop sharing.
Okay. Yes.
And I'm going to ask for questions from the audience and relate them to you. Our first question comes from Samuel Cohn, who asks, what is distinctive about the early modern plagues?
The early modern phase?
Sorry, could I just begin with a comment? I didn't have, I'm a little slow with typing, but if I may begin with a comment and then get to that question, I would appreciate it. It has to do with things that I was a little confused about, and maybe you can clarify. First, from the Sheila Barker article, this whole notion really of contagion supposedly as being something new. I think that's completely false. With the Black Death itself in 1348,
yes,
the word contagio takes on a new meaning, and it becomes really, as best we can see, not only from the medical profession, but also from chronicles, a household term. Household term to be used with diseases. Earlier, contagio had to do with heresy or popular revolt or evil things. Very rarely was it connected to disease, especially from a lay community. The other thing has to do with what you ended on, which was mentality and the effects of mentality on disease, which is an important point, but it's not an early modern point. It goes back to Galen and Galen's 6 naturals, and it's very much embedded in the plague tracts of the 14th century on. Then the final point is this separation really between the scientific and the religious. And I think one sees this radical break, curiously, with Counter-Reformation culture in Italy in the late 16th century, before we get to 1630, where you have doctors, when they're questioned, they say, look, how come you don't start your tract by talking about our sins and God? They say, look, I'm a doctor, and because of that, I'll talk about natural causes and leave the theological ones to the priests. That's a radical break that I think is embedded already in the 15th century, but it becomes much more direct. So what I'm asking then, finally, long-windedly, is what exactly is distinctive, in your opinion, about 1630 or the 17th century plagues?
Okay, thank you very, very much for these very learned comments. Firstly, you are completely right. Many of these themes had earlier roots, but the very fact that they were perhaps present in the discourse of the period is significant. Anyhow, when discussing Poussin's painting, I was following Barker. I was quite convinced, but of course, maybe some of the questions should be directed to her. As a historian of Hebrew poetry, I find in Catalano's poems, in the way that I try to illustrate, exactly the attitude that you described, but in some sort of discourse that combines it with the more traditional biblical and rabbinic elements with some sort of subversions of these texts. And this is very interesting for me as a literary scholar. I'm not an epidemiologist or historian of science, alas, although I'm quite interested in this because it is interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Damon Beller. Was there any apocalyptic outlook from Jews in regards to the Black Death, similar to the flagellants in Christendom?
Oh, that's a big subject. Yes, there were. I mean, take for example not the 14th but the 17th century. You have on the one hand all these outbreaks of epidemics, on the other hand the Shabtai Tzvi and so forth. So it were times of multiple crises, and there were definitely connections between them. That's a very general answer. I'm not sure I can give you a very specific one.
A question from Ido. What do we know about the meaning of the word dever? Was it always plague?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Again, we almost always when we have biblical phrases or words, sometimes we have challenges in finding the specific meaning. But it does seem that dever is some sort of an epidemic, of some sort of a grave illness that make many people dead. If it's exactly the pestilence or not, that's again. Not so clear, but when Catalano uses dever, he definitely refers to the epidemic that he experienced in 1630. Yeah.
And here is a question from Yael Artzi Randrup, who would like to not ask our speaker, but actually ask one of our audience members, Samuel Kahn, about the origin of the text relating to the reply of the doctors. I will only address natural causes, etc. But I'll ask you, please, to keep the answer short, and maybe the two of you could chat if it gets a little bit lengthier, so we can have time for the other questions.
I'm also interested to hear that.
Yeah.
I don't think I understand the question, so maybe I'll pass. I don't understand.
So you'd mentioned that the doctors had said that they would only be touching on natural causes of the disease, and they would leave the theological parts to
the priest. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was wondering about the origin of that text, or.
First of all, one, I had an excellent master's thesis on plague tracts that was completed last year, in which, and it's not so revolutionary, but just how rare mentionings of God, and particularly of God's causes, even going back to the 14th century, were in the medical plague texts. And of course, we're using only the plague text. Well, another question I have for Professor Granat, which is a little bit off this subject, is what strikes me is the rarity of Jewish medical plague tracts, and it could be just because so few of them haven't been edited. But compared to their importance as doctors, especially in Spain and in southern France, why are there so few medical tracts, especially ones that are really original? Like one in Venice in the late 16th century by Davide. Now I can't think of his last name. But anyway, really, excuse me.
Sahalon.
No. At any rate, on that, the earliest I see of this radical break is with the plague of 1576. In 1674 to 1678, depending on where you are in Italy, this pan-Italian plague, where these people come out so directly and saying, and had this radical division Earlier, I think these doctors were sort of covering it up and saying, you know, they would even start with a sort of formula at the beginning of their tract about our sins and about God's punishment. For me, it's the plague of 1576.
Okay.
Thanks.
We have a comment from Margaret Mackay about the Beatons of Mull, just detailing that they were hereditary doctors for the lords of the Isles, Gallic rulers of the Western Isles. So that's an interesting point.
Continued throughout the early modern period. That was why.
Yeah, and their manuscripts show that they were familiar with learned sources from
The Mediterranean and the Middle East.
Okay, thank you.
And many thanks for the fascinating lecture.
Thank you.
And I think we have, when are we supposed to wrap up this session? Should we have one more question, I guess? Okay. There's a comment from Callum Rosak. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing Rosak. The Cassidys of Ireland were the same to the Maguires of Ireland too. And I think I'll just let Ophira wrap up with a few words, but I wanted to thank everyone for coming, for those of you who are already starting to leave, and thank Dr. Granat for such a fascinating talk, really interesting. And I'll turn it to Ophira Gamliel just to wrap up here.
Well, there's another question in the chat from Yael, whether there are any references for vectors as agents of transmission.
Vectors, what do you mean?
Vector would be like a mosquito or a rat or lice or
not in the text of the Catalani, interestingly. I mean, it's much about contagion, including very, very dramatic scenes of how his own daughter got it from an au pair and all sorts of stuff like that. But no, they don't refer to vectors. No.
It seems interesting that they sort of picked up on the idea of contagion from person to person quite early on in an intuitive, non-scientific method way. But vector transmission is something that really remained an enigma almost to the beginning of the 20th century, or related to bad air.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, bad air. Bad air is something.
Bad air. That's the meaning of the word malaria in Italian.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I remember you told me, Yehoshua, that Catalano, the father, the doctor, was ranting about people in the ghetto, in the Jewish ghetto, walking around with the etrog, how you call etrog?
Oh, yes, the citron.
The citron in their noses, as if that will save them.
And he wasn't sure if it's helpful at all. He thought perhaps it's actually it's a problem. He's very much of an empiricist. He says that many medications that are known from the books are useless, so he doesn't mention them. And that's why he makes such a strong stress on social distancing, because that's something that he thinks that works. So he repeats that, and also his son in the poems. Yes.
Yeah, there's another question to both of you who know a little bit about transmission, both participants, Yael and Samuel. The use of brass or copper, I read somewhere or heard somewhere that it's considered to be, even today, antibacterial, like isolating from bacteria or pathogens. So water carried in a copper vessel, they don't accumulate bacteria and so forth. Is that true? Just because he mentions running away from the town with with brass on their shoes, you know, and this whole idea that you remove your shoes in order to keep hygiene, you know, from the outside in your own home.
I can imagine vessels like clay would be contaminated. You could actually have organic substances living in there, whereas metal is something you could more easily clean and purify. You could warm it.
They did have special shoes. You can see it in the paintings. I didn't look into the what they were made of, but yes, it is interesting.
But it's not just metals. From what I hear, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, but this is what I've heard, that with COVID, brass door handles don't transmit the virus. At least nothing on the same level as with metal or plastic.
That's what I heard, something like that, like half ear, but didn't really. So I thought it was really interesting to see it in the poem.
Yeah.
I would just like to wrap up with if anybody would like to continue, it's fine, but I just wanted to bring into your attention ideas about resilience and disaster risk management and disaster risk reduction, and why such texts, especially in our times, or such instances of religious people and religious text, maybe not necessarily religious text, it can be literature of different types, how they function in order to transmit knowledge that accumulates in a scientific way, or from experience of people who experience the disaster, but why is it important to make a poem out of this? I think that's the point. It's a system of knowledge transmission. And this is what I was hoping, you know, to kind of develop this research cluster around, along with my colleagues, because I keep on hearing, once I start engaging with issues of resilience and adaptation and disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management, which is basically, you know, it's like out of the out of the scope of humanities, but I think we should be engaging in that and engaging our colleagues from social sciences and from the sciences as well. Because the big question that people dealing with disaster risk management is how to cross the last mile. We have policies in place, we have the science in place, but what happens when disaster strikes and people don't behave according to the policies? And we can see it very well with the conspiracy theories around and with other cases of, you know, just not heeding the rules about the pandemic and so forth. So this type of poetry, I feel, belongs to that kind of engagement, of asking ourselves how to transmit knowledge and organize people in order to manage disasters, prevent disasters, and also adapt to and be resilient to disasters when they occur. And a very good example I heard about from my Indonesian colleagues is about the tsunami songs from a small island near Indonesia that was struck by a very bad tsunami, was struck by a very bad tsunami in 1924, I think that was the date. And a lot of people perished on that island. I probably mispronounce it, Simul Island, I think. There are many articles written about it by geographers, but I never seen the text itself, or it's a kind of an oral epic. The people after the disaster started telling each within their family a kind of few verses about what happened to their family, and then each tsunami song, Carita Smong, it's called in Indonesian Bahasa, ends with a warning. If you see the water receding and fish started jumping on the shoreline, don't go to catch the fish, you know, go up to the mountains and stay there until, you know, the disaster is over. And what happened in 2004, yeah, which is nearly a century later, with the big tsunami that hit Indonesia and the Indian Ocean, and there were so many casualties in Indonesia. On that island, out of the 24,000 people inhabiting that island, only 4 people died because they were trying to rescue their motorbikes. all the others saw what was happening, escaped to the mountains, and were rescued. So we have also tested, issues around it, that it is helpful. And another example is from Kerala, and two students of ours from Kerala are now present in the crowd. I don't know, yes. We are reading together this flood story from 1921, was it? 1924. 1924, but the flood story probably is written a little bit later. And the place is prone to floods, Kerala in South India. A lot of water flows there anyways, and the monsoon season sometimes becomes heavy, as happened in 2018 and 2019. But the thing about these flood songs in Arabic Malayalam, interestingly, they are mainly written in Arabic Malayalam, and there is one really a poetic and ballad from 1924. It describes in details how people organize in order to support each other during the flood. And also, resonating with Yehoshua's lecture was the idea of belief. When people putting belief and trust in God while they are taking a small boat in order to try and get necessities for the people stranded in the village. So the point is that I feel that we can start thinking about or imagining a study of such texts from different cultures and in different periods and different languages in order to understand how people organize around culture and religion in order to be resilient, not against science, but with science, as they say, with Corona. So I stop here. Thank you very much also for, yes.
Do you know Susan Einbander's book on Hebrew liturgic poetry during the Black Death that came out a couple of years ago? It's very much on this theme. And the other footnote is that Princeton now it's been going on for a couple of years, this big project between historians, epidemiologists, and other scientists and mainly in biology, evolutionary biologists, on disasters, resistance, and transformation. And a book is coming out soon from this group.
I'd be grateful if you can put the references in the chat, so I'll save the chat and I can check it later.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Are you from Glasgow?
Yeah, but I live in Edinburgh, I'm afraid to say.
It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, yes. What a wonderful surprise.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it. I have a lot more questions, but I've already
we'll have to
I usually don't speak in lectures, so this is, I feel, yeah, I've already spouted out enough.
So we'll have to continue that later.
Yeah, I have some specific ones that I'd really like to ask you. But thank you very much.
I can leave the Zoom on. I'll be happy to continue engaging in this.
No, I think that we'll have to.
But if you'd like to leave, it's fine, as you wish. It's not that we have to, leave the room.
But incidentally, yesterday I heard over the radio, I didn't have time to check it out, but some sort of a song in French against Ebola, that there was some sort of a project in Africa of composing songs. I didn't quite follow, but exactly in the same it connects very nicely with what you said. And I was wondering about the Malayalam song. You said it from the 1920s. Isn't there an earlier tradition of this kind of like oral songs of transmitting this kind of lessons from past events? Or because I'd be surprised if they invented it only in the 1920s.
I don't know. We start to, it's first of all, it's Arabic Malayalam. So the idea to talk about disasters, it's history, it's not necessarily oral. It was written in Arabic Malayalam. But there is, I think, Harita, you found a verse in Sanskrit from the 16th century that relates to a flood, to a big flood. Yeah, so there is literature about disasters, and maybe that's also the origins of the biblical stories about the plagues and the floods and the hailstorm, etc. Thank you, Saeko. So yeah, there's a wonderful book by Amitav Ghosh. It's called The Great Derangement: Climate Change and the Unthinkable. And it's kind of rants against the modern and postmodern literature that completely avoids talking about such disaster, where realism is considered to be like what happens to an individual in their life. So he talks about this thing that disasters are completely absent from novels, for example. But I think that's not the case with literature, which is not modern, novel literature, that is not that kind of realism, modern and postmodern realism. That's my little note about this. So probably there's a lot more to find there. Yeah.
Yes.
So.
Okay, so thank you very much again for inviting me.
Thank you, Yehoshua. It was really great. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mia, for sharing. And
yes,
all of you for coming and commenting. It's really great.
Yes.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. אני נשארת עוד קצת.
כן, אני גם משער.
איך שאתה רוצה. That's my aunt from Amsterdam.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah. Okay, it was really great.
עכשיו תגידי לי איך היה, אבל במליאלם.
מי זה עוד איתנו? אני לא יודעת. האייפון של מישהו. לא יודעת מי זה. היה אחלה, היה ממש מעולה.
טוב, אז אנחנו...
כן, אני מקווה שגם אתה... אוי, אני אפסיק להקליט, לא צריך להקליט עכשיו.